There's a photograph that most Americans have never seen. It was taken in the early 1950s, somewhere in the middle of St. Paul, Minnesota. In it, you can see a street, a perfectly ordinary American street. Cobblestone, lined with small businesses, families sitting on stoops, children walking home from school. A barbershop, a grocery store, a church on the corner. And if you look closely at the faces of the people on that street, you can see something unmistakable. Ease, belonging, the look of a place where people feel at home. That street was called Rondo Avenue, and by 1968 it was gone. Not abandoned, not slowly emptied by economic decline. Gone, bulldozed, erased, buried under 12 lanes of concrete called Interstate 94. And here is what makes this story different from every other highway versus neighborhood story you have ever heard. There was another route. Engineers had drawn it. City officials had studied it. It would have caused far less damage. And it was rejected. The reason why tells you everything about how American cities were built and who was allowed to live in them. My name is Willian, and this is America's Forgotten Structures. Today we go to St. Paul, Minnesota, and we trace the decision that destroyed the most prosperous Black neighborhood in the state's history. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what Rondo was. From the late 1800s, Rondo Avenue and the neighborhood surrounding it had become the heart of Black life in the Twin Cities. It wasn't an accident. Racial covenants, legal agreements written directly into property deeds, barred Black families from purchasing homes in most of St. Paul's neighborhoods. Rondo was one of the few places where they could, and so they built something extraordinary. By the 1930s and 40s, Rondo was home to approximately 85% of St. Paul's entire African-American population. But this was not a ghetto in the way the word is so often misused. This was a community, economically diverse, institutionally rich, socially tight. The Hallie Q. Brown Community Center anchored the neighborhood's civic life. The Pilgrim Baptist Church drew thousands every Sunday. The Sterling Club was one of the finest social clubs in the Midwest, frequented by figures like Roy Campanella and Cab Calloway when they passed through town. There were lawyers, teachers, doctors, small business owners. There were neighborhoods within the neighborhood. Residents still remember the distinct personalities of blocks with names like Oatmeal Hill and Cornmeal Valley. Pullman porters, who formed the backbone of the Black middle class across the northern United States, settled in Rondo because the railroad lines ran close. Kodak, one of the region's largest employers, had workers here. The community owned its homes, built its wealth incrementally, passed it down through generations. In short, Rondo worked. And then the federal government arrived with a plan. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, at the time the single largest public works investment in American history. The interstate highway system would connect the country, reduce travel times, and, according to planners, modernize American cities. What the official announcements did not emphasize was the detail that would prove most consequential. Someone had to decide exactly where to put the roads. For St. Paul, the task was connecting downtown to the suburbs to the west and to Minneapolis to the east. The chosen route would become Interstate 94. And for this section of the highway, planners identified two options. The first was known as the Northern Route. It ran along existing railroad tracks, through an underutilized industrial corridor north of the central neighborhoods. George Harold, St. Paul's own city engineer, backed this option. It would displace fewer people, avoid the densest residential areas, and still connect the required points. The cost and technical difficulty were comparable to the alternative. The second option was the St. Anthony route, named for St. Anthony Avenue, a road that ran parallel to Rondo. This route cut straight through the residential heart of the neighborhood. The St. Anthony route was chosen. In the years that followed, community leaders organized immediately. Reverend Floyd Massey and Timothy Howard formed the Rondo St. Anthony Improvement Association in 1955. They lobbied, they testified, they circulated petitions. They could not stop the highway, but they achieved one partial victory. The road would be built below grade, sunken into the earth rather than elevated on pylons. This would reduce some of the noise and visual destruction for residents on either side. It was a small consolation for what came next. Construction on the I-94 corridor through Rondo began in the late 1950s and continued through 1968. What followed was the systematic dismantling of a community. Families received notices from the Housing and Redevelopment Authority of St. Paul. Their properties had been assessed and a purchase price had been determined. Prices that community records and later studies consistently describe as far below market value. Those who refused to sell or who contested the offers faced the full weight of the state's power of eminent domain. In some documented cases, residents who held out too long were met with law enforcement at their door. Over the course of a decade, more than 700 family homes were demolished. More than 300 businesses were closed or torn down. Churches, social clubs, barbershops, the community institutions that had taken generations to build, gone. 1 in every 8 African Americans in St. Paul lost their home. And unlike the white families also displaced by highway construction in this era, who in many cases had access to federal relocation programs and newly built suburban housing, black families from Rondo largely did not. Racial covenants and discriminatory lending practices meant that most of them could not simply move elsewhere in the city and start over. They scattered. The networks dissolved. The wealth that had been concentrated in Rondo, in the form of homeownership, business equity, and community capital, evaporated. A study published in 2020 calculated the lost home equity alone at nearly $160 million, compounded over time. If you drive through St. Paul today and take the exit near downtown, you will cross a massive concrete trench. 12 lanes of traffic move through it at speed, a gray scar running east to west through the city. Above it, 4 bridges connect the two halves of what was once one neighborhood: Lexington, Victoria, Dale, and Western Avenues. People cross them every day. Most do not know what lies beneath them. What is striking, standing on one of those bridges, is how ordinary everything looks. There is nothing to mark what was here. No monument, no plaque visible from the road, no indication that an entire world once existed in this space. The erasure was not only physical, it was historical. The community did not disappear quietly, though. Since 1983, the annual Rondo Days Festival has drawn former residents back every summer. People who haven't seen each other in decades, reconnecting in what historian Marvin Roger Anderson described as a place where military, professional, and streetwise black people could gather, talk, and exchange ideas. The festival is part reunion, part act of historical preservation, a deliberate refusal to let the memory go. And in recent years, something larger has begun to take shape. In 2022, the United States Department of Transportation launched the Reconnecting Communities program, a federal initiative designed in part to address the documented harms caused by highway construction on American neighborhoods. The language of the program explicitly acknowledges what planners once refused to: that infrastructure decisions were made on the basis of race, and that those decisions have had generational consequences. St. Paul's Rondo community was among the first to receive funding. The organization Reconnect Rondo has been developing a proposal for a land bridge, a decked structure built over the I-94 trench that would physically reconnect the two halves of the neighborhood. In 2023, the project received a $2 million federal grant. The design process is ongoing. What a land bridge can and cannot do is worth thinking about carefully. It cannot return the 700 homes. It cannot reconstitute the Sterling Club or the Hallie Q. Brown Community Center. It cannot restore the $160 million in generational wealth. What it can do, according to the community members and urban planners behind it, is stitch back together a physical wound that has been open for 60 years. Give back a landmark. Make the scar visible, and then begin, slowly, to heal it. Whether that is enough is a question the people of Rondo are still answering. There is a version of American infrastructure history that presents these decisions as neutral, as the inevitable math of route efficiency and federal funding formulas. The story of Rondo is a refutation of that version. The northern route existed. Engineers approved it. It was rejected. The choice was not inevitable. It was made. And the people who paid for it were a community that had, despite every obstacle placed in front of them, built something worth protecting. St. Paul's Transportation Commissioner and the city's mayor formally apologized to the Rondo community in 2014. The apology was sincere, and it was late, and it was not enough. But there is something in the existence of that apology, in the fact that a city looked back at a decision made 60 years earlier and said plainly, this was wrong, that points toward what accountability in urban planning might actually look like. Rondo Avenue no longer exists as it once did, but the people who remember it, and the people who grew up hearing about it from parents and grandparents who do, are still here. And they are still building. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to America's Forgotten Structures. Every week, we investigate the places, decisions, and structures that shaped American cities and the communities that live through them. Leave a comment below. What forgotten story from your city deserves to be told next?